Everyone can hear? Okay. Welcome. Thank you for joining us for the final panel of the day before the Peabody tour. My name is Melissa Grafe. I'm head of the Medical Historical Library here at Yale and the Librarian for Medical History. And I am delighted to welcome our speakers today on the topic that we're going to be considering. As you may have read, this panel explores the roles of museums and universities in the production of scientific racism and colonialism, and the ways that curators, artists, journalists, scholars, and others are contesting such legacies today. Throughout the conference, I was on Zoom, watching it through Zoom this morning, and I saw many people, many of the presenters, showing resources from different archives and different libraries and different museums. And some of these materials, some of the materials that you saw on these slides are things that we work with every day. We bring these materials to classes. We teach, we work with students. We encourage people to research these materials. And some of this material, a lot of the material is rough, right? There are legacies related to racism, to slavery, to eugenics, that are all part of the objects and books and archives that are the foundation for the talks that you heard earlier this morning. So it is with some of my colleagues that are part of this panel, and really individuals who work in cultural heritage institutions that often reckon with again, just larger concerns, legacies, considerations, trauma that come from these materials. So I'm looking forward to hearing what our presenters have to say today in terms of the topic. Let me introduce everybody briefly. I'm going to start with Royce Youngwolf, who is the Peabody Museum's inaugural collection manager of its Native American collection, and the Yale Art Gallery's first assistant curator of Native American art. Her responsibilities include managing the museum's Native American materials, organizing exhibitions and permanent exhibits, acquiring artworks, coordinating programming related to the collection, and forging relationships with Native American and Indigenous artists and communities. Nicole Dungca is a reporter in the Washington Post Investigative Unit. She was the co-host of Broken Doors, an investigative podcast that won the Robert F. Kennedy Journalism Award for radio, and was a finalist in the audio reporting category of the Pulitzer Prize. Before the Post, she was part of the Boston Globe Spotlight team, where she delved into topics such as racism in Boston, secret criminal hearings in Massachusetts, the state's burgeoning cannabis industry, and transportation. Her recent Washington Post series on human remains in the Smithsonian's collection will be the focus of her talk today. Alexi Baker, who will not be joining us today but has provided a presentation, is the History of Science and Technology Collection Manager at the Peabody Museum. She's a historian of science and technology focused on museums since 2003, and a science writer and communicator since 1998. She manages the Yale Peabody Museum's History of Science and Technology collection, which consists of more than 15,000 historical scientific instruments, other scientific artifacts, and historical technologies. Finally, Elaine Ayers joined Yale as a lecturer in the history of science and medicine in 2024. She works on the history of natural history, colonial violence, and collecting in the 18th and 19th centuries. She holds a PhD in the history of science from Princeton University and previously taught in New York University's program in museum studies, New York University's Gallatin School of Individualized Study, and Brown University's program in Science, Technology, and Society. She teaches collections situated between the arts and sciences and consults at museums and botanical gardens around the world, particularly in repatriation efforts. So let me invite Royce up to start the presentations, and we'll go from there.
All right, Dorati Mabisagit Mitskirishtawakish. Thank you, everyone, for joining us today. We have about 10 minutes Most of my presentations, I like to open the space in song. I won't be doing that today. Instead, I will be sharing a spoken word piece, as I am an artist, spoken word artist, poet, in addition to all of the collection and curatorial work that I take a responsibility to do. Where's the clicker? Okay. Let the tech.
I know, I'm not quite the tech, but we have that tech coming down. So I think it's actually here. Is that?
Okay.
Very up and down all the time.
You got it.
I just used the arrow button. Would you prefer it for the clicker? It was.
Yeah, we'll just use the arrow then.
Oh, so enough what you got. Click on it.
Okay.
There we go. There we
Okay.
go. It works.
Okay. So we're here to discuss the legacy of colonization in museums. Museums are inherently colonial. That's just base where we're starting. One of the deeply embedded practices of colonialism is the dehumanization of materials by relabeling them as objects, dehumanization of humans themselves by relabeling them as species or subjects or others. A lot of the work that I do is to try and just simply humanize us again. All of us are brought to this space and this practice for many different intentions. For Indigenous people, most of us feel a calling and a burden and responsibility to unsettle these museum spaces. And we do that in many different ways. The way that I love to do this type of work is through human connections, is building relationships. That also means I have to be more open about who I am, my background, my expertise, my kinship, my people, my upbringing, all of the things that technically we're not really supposed to ask each other to share. That's almost an open book for me. So I want to share with you one of the works that I wrote as a reflection on this type of experience. I'm continuing on a language journey with my Hiraacá people. Hiraacá is my first language that I lost once I became part of a Catholic Indian boarding school called St. Libre in Montana. In the Hiraacá language, a lot of words make reference to experiences, embodied experiences. Our language is polysynthetic. Each word has multiple meanings, and those meanings are attached to context. So context. So Dungca, Lara, Dungca, Hiraacá. Here, where is heart? Here, where is heart? Bloodletting, neatly preserved, acid-free, stripped layers of stratigraphy. Tongues called to elicit meanings from bleached bones, tenderly wrapped complexities. Here, where is heart? Here, where is heart? Dungca, Lara, Dungca, Hiraacá. My kin stored in archival boxes, my kin objects uncovered bare. My kin, fibers of memories, materiality, tell me, where is heart? Dungca, Lara, Dungca, Hiraacá. Where is the horizon line, folded over memories like verses incised across fired, clay carved from dogwood, woven in cedar bark, bitings, hides, ledgers. Your memories, this work, haunted layers of stratigraphy, complexities. Dungca, Lara, Dungca, Hiraacá. Materiality, provenance, provenience, complexities, stratigraphy of memory. Here, where is heart? Here, where is heart? Dungca, nara, Dungca, hiro. So many scholars that write and investigate and do meaningful work always talk about their experience in museums, collection work, exhibition development, decolonizing museum spaces. There are all these complexities wrapped up. All of these areas give way to things that we seem to look at as impossible, that we can't quite reach a point to convince people to have a heart. And so the work that I do is to understand the people that I'm working with and to understand the history and the complexities of a place, contextual meanings. That means that I have to get people in a space and comfortability with me where they are open and willing to be uncomfortable. Decolonization is an entryway to awareness. And awareness means that you begin to have a heart. You don't just simply say you have empathy. You actually begin to meet the people whose items, material, cultural items, ceremonial items, human remains and ancestral beings are actually their responsibility to steward. And so here at the Peabody, I've been very excited because I've met some wonderful people who do that type of work on their own, not necessarily focused on indigenous materials, but simply bringing their heart to their job. So we've begun this journey to, one, see who knows what decolonization is, see who understands what the history of the places that they work in actually is, and to also dig a little bit deeper to understand, are they aware of how their presence and activities continue to impact those descendant communities that are forever going to be involved and engaged with the works that are on display in those museums. Assumptions about their education and awareness, even my own education and awareness of a place and a people, is a way that we start to backpedal into colonization, is we assume everyone is coming to meet us at the same point in time. And that's not always true. Decolonization work begins from a place of relationality. Relationality is how we relate to each other in simple terms. It's also about kinship. What is our investment? What are we getting out of all of this? And then how open can we be about our positionalities of who we actually are, how this work will continue to impact us, and how much of that is actually us volunteering to take on a responsibility, or do we just clock out at the end of the day? Because it's really just a job. Thankfully, I work with people who, they live and breathe this. They really want to be part of it and impactful. I also work with people who it's their job. And that's very, very important to understand, because you can't teach these ways of knowing if someone isn't open to actually carrying them. So indigenous ways of knowing and understanding is a base platform foundation of the type of work that we do to decolonize museum spaces. I always go back and look at other scholars and mentors. One that I'm constantly looking to as a mentor is Margaret Kovac, Indigenous Methodologies. She writes, self-location anchors knowledge within experiences, and these experiences greatly influence interpretations. In museum spaces, as well as art gallery spaces, there's the practice of interventions at many different levels, and that includes labels. Most often you don't read who's actually writing those labels, from whose perspective, whose positionality. Is it someone you can relate to? Or is it someone that just had a job to do to edit it down to 30 words or 15 words at an educational level? Those points of intervention are really important. And they're ways that we can put effort into writing that maybe is good for people who aren't so comfortable with opening themselves out and exposing themselves to more of the hands-on, culturally responsive care. Culturally responsive care can be applied to collection management. It can be applied to exhibition development. It can be applied to greetings. It simply means that you are taking the time to be reflective. You're taking the time to understand who your audience is, what the materials are you're working with, what is their long history. That's not always easy, though. And so being strategic about assessing what do we know as a base foundation of knowledge in the places that we work, and how can we implement tasks, workshops, trainings, and materials to actually raise that awareness. That begins to create a more meaningful decolonization process. Again, I don't look at decolonization as an end result. I look at decolonization as an entryway point to have these larger discussions about realistic applications, rematriation, policies, procedures, and how we can make museums a more welcoming space and a safe space. So much of the work that I do, I've found that comprehension is not the issue. It's not an issue of whether or not someone can understand. It's an issue of whether or not they really want to take the initiative and begin training that many people who are connected to the materials in museums, they've grown up with those stories. They've grown up with a perspective and an idea of where they're going, what this work actually means and the impactfulness of it. So to try to make that more simple, empathy is just the question about where is the heart. Awareness is what are the true goals. And then true interventions happen with context-driven solutions. Every single museum, every single gallery, community, team members, types of departments are going to have different areas of application of culturally responsive care. Another scholar, Nancy Marie Mithlow, says, "It is important to establish the fact that Native arts scholarship is a profession, and like any profession, it requires qualifications, training, and access. Admittance into the field of American Indian arts as a scholar necessitates knowing a set of rules to even begin the practice of research and writing. These rules are often opaque, requiring translation." We find that's true in museum work as well. We have an assumption that high level of skills in administrative work or procedures equates to a high level of skills of understanding how you work with Indigenous people. That's not always the case. It also sometimes you assume that you have a high level of understanding of how to work with underrepresented groups or how to work with very diverse groups. Taking the time to actually meet with each other and develop a baseline of where we're all coming together and where we're starting, what our goals are, those are ways that we can simplify decolonization. In exhibition development, I found that small groups made of people who voluntarily want to do this type of culturally responsive care, collection management, handling, object movement, display, mount making, it's necessary they volunteer, that it's not something they're forced into, that they're checking a box, because that's where heart is. And ethically, then I can build relationships with stakeholders who I can honestly say, yes, everyone who comes into contact with these items for this exhibit development cares about you, cares about the impact they have on your communities, on you yourself and your family. That's where we begin to decolonize, is by connecting to each other on a very basic level. So mazigrat, agetewesegets. I think questions are at the end. All right, thank you very much.
Just figuring out the mic. Thank you so much for having me. I am a journalist. I am not in academia. I do not always go into archives, and after doing this project with my team, I am so grateful to you all. I am so grateful to the historians and archivists who made this possible. The work of so many historians, archivists, librarians, and activists are the only reason we were able to tell these stories, and so I'm very grateful to be in this room and having these kinds of conversations because I feel like you really understand where we were going with this project, and if you haven't seen it before, I'm really excited to show you. So this was a project from our team. I'm on the Washington Post's investigative unit. I'm lucky enough to focus on many different subjects, and for this particular subject, we focused on the Smithsonian Institution's collection of human remains. And so, you know, for many people in Native American communities, for many people who work within the museum communities, the idea that there are human remains being stored within museums across the country is not surprising at all. As someone who is not from those communities, when I heard about one of my colleagues working on this project, it was shocking, and it was something that I really wanted to help shed light on. The reason we were able to put so much time into this is because the Smithsonian Institution, which was in our own backyard, I work and live in DC, has one of the largest collections of human remains in the world. There are more than 30,000 different body parts, and I say that, and I'm glad Royce brought up humanizing these people that are within these collections, because the entire project is about that. When we are using the terms human remains, I think sometimes it is also lost, however, that this was a very unsettling period of time where people's graves were being looted en masse and people's organs were being taken from them in the name of science. And so I'll be using human remains and body parts, but just want to make sure that you know where I'm coming from that. So, you know, this has been happening for a really long time. This is not surprising to people, but the scale at which it happened at the turn of the century, I think, was very surprising when we learned about it. Whenever you talk to anyone who knows about human remains within museums, they will say scientists and museum curators traded body parts like baseball cards, like Pokemon cards. They had so many of these different kinds of body parts. The vast majority of these actually were from Native American communities, partly because many of these anthropologists, many of these collectors would go to burial mounds, to graveyards, specifically to collect Native American people's remains. And the reason behind that is from a racist idea that because, you know, they believed that they were primitive and they were able to find out more about history because of this. Our colleagues at ProPublica, another publication, actually the same year we released this, did an excellent series called The Repatriation Project. And they focused solely on Native American remains, which are all over. The human remains are in every museum. I think if you go to a museum, just know that they have collected them at some point. And so we were going into repatriation. And so the idea of repatriation actually started about, a couple of decades ago, and the Smithsonian Institution was the first institution that was actually mandated to return some of these human remains. There are 2 federal laws that mandate this. And this did not come because the museums wanted to do this. It was actually a very big fight. The only reason that these laws were passed were because of decades and decades of activism from Native American communities and activists. And so the Smithsonian was the first institution that was supposed to, by law, return these remains. The year afterward, Congress passed the Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act, called NAGPRA, which is actually much more well-known because it applies to all museums across the country that get federal funding. And so part of what we wanted to do with the collection, with our project, was show some of the humans who were in these collections. And partly we were focusing on this because Alice Hrdlicka, who was the curator of the now it's cultural, it is biomedical anthropology at this point. Back then it was physical anthropology and has kind of changed the name. He was the curator at the Smithsonian Institution, and he was very much a leader in the space. He was obsessive about collecting human remains. He was also obsessive about studying race. A lot of what he cared about were the differences between race. I saw the last Eugenics at Yale presentation, and so much of it was what my team and I researched. These ideas of these different studies. He once went to a New York, basically an orphanage, and he would measure all these different organs from kids who were in these orphanages, and then did it by race, and then thought that it taught him something, but even though they were already separated by race. So a lot of his obsession about collecting these human remains came from wanting to study the differences between races. And he did it. Over time, the Smithsonian Institution collected more than 30,000. And then one of the things that we found was that there was also a brain collection, and that's partly how this all came to our attention. Actually, a Filipino activist in St. Louis, she had been researching, and we'll get into it, Filipinos who had come to the 1904 World's Fair to be put on display. People called it a human zoo. Some of them died, and Alice Hrdlicka, knowing that some of those people died, traveled to St. Louis expressly to collect their brains. And so this activist, Jana Anunuevo Langholtz, she began telling this story, and that caught the eye of one of my colleagues who wanted to learn more about it, started working on this story. And then my joke is that I am Filipino, and anytime someone says Filipino at the Washington Post newsroom, I appear. I'm like, what are we talking about? And so once I learned about these stories, I was immediately hooked. And one of the things that we do at the Post is we focus on things if there's going to be some sort of impact, if we think there's something that should be done. Obviously, this all happened in history, but what we knew is that there were 30,000 human remains still at the Smithsonian Institution. The vast majority of them, of both of those federal laws that I mentioned, only said that Native American remains had to be returned. And so that meant the remains of everybody else, there were no laws mandating that they should be returned to anyone. And so in a way, we knew that there were just all these thousands of human remains that were going to stay there, and very few people outside of these communities who were already engaged with it knew about this. So we wanted to make sure we were able to talk about this issue, but also from outset, we wanted to make sure that we found the families that were within this collection. And so these are just some of the numbers that we were talking about. We were able to get basically a spreadsheet that showed how many individual remains they had. And, obviously, these are older collections. These are legacy collections. I think it's safe to say that most people who come to the Smithsonian and do not think that they, want to work with these remains, but they are in storage. And so for a lot of these museums, they don't necessarily know what they're going to do with them. But they came from all over 80 plus countries. And then most of them had not been returned. But as you can see, more than 4,000 had been offered for return. And the vast majority of those were for Native American communities, for tribes and tribal nations, because it's mandated by federal law. And so we were particularly interested in the brain collection because it represented, a very different kind of collection. I think all of these kinds of collections of human remains can be very unsettling, but for them to collect these human brains, Hrdlička often had to target morgues, had to target hospitals, had to target places within the DC area, so that he could get human remains. Like soft tissue collections obviously are much harder to maintain because you have to preserve them in a certain way. So it was a much smaller collection, but that also meant that a lot of these people had names attached to them, and that's what we knew and what we wanted to find. So this is the makeup of some of these brains at the Smithsonian collection. They still have, by the time we started working on this story, there were only 4 brains that had been returned to families or to communities, and then our work helped spur the return of another one to a family, and I'll get to it right now. And so we did a little bit of what many of you know as researchers. We did a little detective work. We were looking at these documents from the Smithsonian archives that showed basically how they were cataloged within the collection. And as you can see, they didn't even have their names when it came to the actually accession cards. It was just saying, these are the people, and they were being labeled basically as their identities because that's why Alice Hrdlička wanted to have them. And they were using outdated racist terms in some cases. But we also saw that Alice Hrdlička had an entire network of people who were working with him. So for example, this is a doctor who worked with Native American communities within various government agencies. He worked in Juneau, he worked in Albuquerque, and then whenever he was treating some of these people, he would sometimes ask Alice Hrdlička if he wanted a brain of a certain type. And that led us to this woman named Mary Sara. Partly how we found her is that this one note, this one that looks like Mary Sarai, she was an indigenous Sami woman who was born in Alaska. They used the outdated term in this particular note. She had died of tuberculosis. Charles Firestone had actually treated her for her illness in the sanitarium, and then when she died, he sent a telegram to Alice Hrdlička that really highlights just, how very inhumane these kinds of trades were, which is if the subject full blood, brain desirable, basically asking, do you want this brain for your collection? And he did. It was sent to the Smithsonian Institution. The way we were able to find some of these families was by obsessively going through, and I'm sure you all know, newspaper archives, trying to find old death certificates, and we had a huge breakthrough. We actually had a huge breakthrough when we realized it was Mary Sara, because it looks like Mary Sarai here, but we reached out to a local indigenous, a North American indigenous Sami organization. We said, do you know anyone who might know somebody named Mary Sarai? And they said, actually, Sara is a very common name, and they put us in touch with people who were descended from that family. But by getting that name, we were able to find Mary's death certificate, basically, that gave us more information about why she was there. She was 18. We were able to find newspapers.com and ancestry.com were huge, huge repositories of information for us. But we were shocked that we were able to find information about Mary Sarah because newspapers had written about her. She had actually come to Seattle because her mother had been blind, but Charles Firestone, the doctor who treated Mary Sarah for tuberculosis, wanted the mother to come and so he could perform surgery, so she could regain her sight. And so they wrote about her. And here you already see just how newspapers were treating them basically as these exotic people, basically like they weren't really humans. They were just saying, oh, wow, she no girl in parka from Alaska likes sniff of snow and air. Like that's literally what they were saying. And so this is Mary. And that's a picture that we had. And so these are actually Mary Sarah's descendants. This woman on the left, Martha Sarah Jack, that is her cousin. That is her first cousin. And we were able to find her after that Sami organization gave us a name and put us in touch with a distant relative who put us in touch with Martha. And we called her and we were like, do you have any idea? We know this was like a really long time ago. She died in 1933. Like, do you know Mary Sarah? Like, did your mom ever talk about her? And she said, oh, Mary? And we were on Zoom. She took this photo, this framed photo of Mary Sarah, and she showed it to us. And it was one of the most remarkable reporting moments that I've had, because how often we were just seeing, is there any sort of mention of her in any of your family lore? But this woman was so connected to her that she knew stories about her from her mother. And I think this is the biggest reason we started this kind of reporting, because there were families that were being affected by this even today. And so Martha and her daughter and other people were very, very upset about this, and I have to keep going because I'm taking too much time. But we did get her brain returned. And just quickly to go to another story that we did. This was about the 1904 World's Fair. And I don't know if we can we play the 10-second clip? Yeah, it is embedded, but it's not. Yeah, oh. Okay, sorry about that. And so this is the story of another woman whose brain had been in the collection. And we created a illustrated graphic novel about it because we didn't have any photos of her. So here we go.
It would have been her first time seeing snow. Nearly 1 month before, Maura had arrived in St. Louis from the Philippines. She had come for the 1904 World's Fair, a historic exhibition of U.S. expansionism and innovation. But Maura wasn't attending the fair. She and her fellow Filipinos were there to be put on display.
Leave you on that cliffhanger. But just to kind of wrap up quickly, I mean, I hope you'll our code that will take you there. But a lot of the research that we did to make this illustrated investigation involved a lot of records so that it would be as accurate as possible. We went to as many records as we could. We went to historians, people who knew the indigenous Filipino communities and had descendants who had gone to the 1904 World's Fair. And so we followed her story and released that basically a comic form in the Washington Post as a way to give voice to some of these people within this collection. So I'll wrap that up there, but I hope you'll take a look at it, and I'll be happy to answer questions afterward. Thanks.
As I mentioned, Dr. Alexi Baker can't join us today, but was kind enough to give us a pre-recorded presentation, which I will hopefully play. When we go into questions, if there are any specific questions for Dr. Baker, she's encouraged me to say to just email her directly, and I'm happy to share that information if you need it. Thank you.
For medical reasons, but thank you so much to the conference organizers for letting me still contribute my video, and thank you to them and to the conference sponsors for staging such an important event. I've been operating the Peabody Museum's Division of History of Science and Technology since 2017, and today I'm going to talk about the panel topic with respect to that collection. The History of Science and Technology collection, or HST, really began at the Peabody in 1960. That year, Professor Derek DeSola Price from History of Science started to collect together mainly Yale's own historical scientific instruments, as well as some donations. And he continued doing that until he passed away in 1983. And after that, it was really a tiny number of part-time staff, volunteers, faculty members, including most recently Professor Paolo Bertucci, who saw the collection survive and indeed continue to grow. And it's only more recently that we got nice new storage and work facilities, and also for the first time a dedicated exhibition gallery in the renovated Peabody Museum. HST is now a nationally, and in some respects internationally, important collection of more than 15,000 artifacts. These are objects, images, and archives related to all different aspects of science, medicine, and technology. The majority were made in Europe and North America within the past 500 years, and almost none by indigenous communities. A large proportion were also drawn from Yale itself, although we've always received donations from many other sources. This collection can speak to all different aspects of Yale's own history since 1701, of European and American history more broadly, and actually of much longer and more global histories than you might think. And this includes the roles played by prejudice, scientific racism, and colonialism in these times and places, as well as their enduring impacts. And of course, interconnected histories of gender, sexuality, disability, and class. But at the same time, the very nature of the HST collection often suggests or reinforces for many people colonialist or Eurocentric conceptions of science, technology, and museums. And this is something that we have to actively combat. With all of the diverse activities that we do and support with the collection, there are a number of key ways that I and we try to incorporate and respond to these themes. One strategy is just being clear and upfront about the nature of the HST collection itself, and about how the histories to which the objects speak include those themes. And this includes with respect to Yale and the Peabody's own histories. We emphasize that HST is a geographically and culturally specific collection which arose out of Yale. It's not an encyclopedic representation of human knowledge production and technology, and nor is its Yale-flavored view of those things the pinnacle of human achievement. This leads to a second important strategy, which is emphasizing that although our objects are skewed towards specific places, times, and cultures, science and technology were and are, in fact, very global and interconnected and much broader in definition. We work to express these things verbally and visually in all of our activities, but I also do what I can to connect collection users with other relevant collections, sources, and people, helping to broaden their historical context and their material and visual resources. Hopefully in the future, how our objects are described in the museum's database, and therefore in LUTs, will also include a lot more of this historical context. I'm a collection staff of one, and I only recently gained access to more student employees and more Peabody staff with whom I can collaborate, so I'm afraid there's a lot left to do. A third strategy is to try to ensure that our voices are not the only ones being heard about these issues in all of our activities, and this includes when we seek feedback about the work that we and others are doing. I'm especially looking forward to the possibilities as the Reopen Peabody expands its public programming in K-12 collaborations. We are not the experts on some of these histories. We also can't speak to the experience of past and present racism and scientific racism. And it's also important to reflect how, both historically and today, a wide variety of people have been and are involved in science, medicine, and technology. And that is a fourth of our major strategies, emphasizing that in lots of times and places of prejudice, oppression, and violence, those targeted were still involved in making history, and specifically in science and technology, in a variety of ways. And this includes the most active and traditionally celebrated of ways. It can be difficult to convince people, including some historians, of this. There are entrenched ideas that prejudiced beliefs and institutions entirely prevented people from impacting or benefiting from things like science and technology. And that's just not true, as evidenced by a wide range of research from history and other disciplines. And if we ignore this, we're not actually understanding the past and its implications for the present and future. It also reinforces the erasures and exclusions wrought by prejudice, concealing many contributions from historical actors who were people of color or of different gender or sexual identities. This is related to a fifth key strategy. I do everything in my power to convey that the ways in which different types of people were involved in and impacted by histories, including that of science and technology, well, that's just history. These are not sidelines or add-ons to history, which we research and share for ethical or feel-good reasons, like, here, have some Black or Indigenous or women's history as a treat. These subjects are as vital to our understanding of the past and its implications as the economic or social or scientific dimensions. They should have always been researched and shared in museums as well. And again, it can be difficult to convince people of this, not just because of prejudice, but because of assumptions about the historical impacts of prejudice, because of assumptions that if these stories were important, they would have already been told. And also, a lot of the related research is newer, which can make it seem like a separate specialty or a separate movement. Since I now have only a few minutes left, I'll briefly discuss Yale classes and student projects and exhibitions including our new gallery, which some of you will be visiting after this panel. Our objects are used in diverse classes for reflecting on the themes of this conference, whether for courses specifically focused on colonialism or racism or collecting, or to ensure that these themes are represented within broader histories. I've personally often used objects like anthropometric artifacts, items related to the eugenicist Robert Yerkes, colonial era and non-European instruments, and images including on lantern slides, which reflect attitudes towards Black and Indigenous Americans. I also find it really exciting how student projects can explore related histories. These include projects assigned during classes, independent historical and artistic and museum projects, and also ones which I've personally assigned during student internships and employment. Students contribute to our digital and multimedia materials and tours and talks as well. And these student activities can shed light on Yale's and the Peabody's own past connections to scientific racism, which are not that difficult to uncover. This includes specific eugenicist individuals and specimen collections at the Peabody, and specific scientific instruments in the HST collection, which we can show are sometimes used in such research. HST also contributes related objects and information to exhibitions at and beyond the Peabody, whether that be in a major way like with the Crafting Worldviews exhibition at the Art Gallery, in which we were directly involved, or just when I provide background information when making exhibition loans. In our new History of Science and Technology gallery, I and Paolo Bertucci tried to bring together all of the considerations which I've discussed today, while sharing a selection of objects from our collection and related Yale, national, and global histories. For example, on the big introductory panel for the gallery, we're upfront about the specific nature of the collection. We and many other Peabody staff members and advisors spent eons just trying to figure out how to position the HST gallery with respect to the anthropology galleries, what to call it, and how to introduce it. to avoid suggesting untrue Eurocentric or colonialist narratives about knowledge and innovation. We incorporated a number of specific historical figures into the gallery to illuminate these themes as well, including the full array of participation and impacts, while highlighting the concept of hidden figures. We have a number of modern people other than us speaking directly to museum visitors too. Other historians, including from the Yale and Slavery Project, modern scientists and doctors and students, and Yale's scientific glassblowers, and many more people and groups also kindly provided us with feedback over the years. Throughout the gallery, we interwove the facts and stories related to the conference themes with all of the other aspects of history, the cultural, social, economic, technological, and scientific, and other dimensions. And then there are specific places where we also go into the conference themes in a bit more depth. For example, we emphasize the more global and longer histories of these types of artifacts and activities throughout, but we also dedicated the central case with the rotating and exploding astrolabes to that theme. Contemplation and Conquest is a large case about the intertwined activities and technologies of astronomy, navigation, and surveying, and it also incorporates the colonialist dimensions of these histories and how people of color were not just impacted by them, but sometimes actively involved in them. Connections to slavery are discussed at greater length within the case entitled Yale and the World. The large case opposite about electricity specifically talks about racial prejudice hindering black scientists. With the case focused on telecommunications and audio, we use the story of Gutta Percha to explore the human, environmental, and technological impacts of natural materials around the world, through a resource map from one of our collaborators and a dedicated interactive on the adjoining monitor. And we have a case specifically dedicated to eugenics at Yale, using some of our artifacts related to Robert Yerkes. We also want there to be an accompanying interactive on the adjoining monitor, given what an important subject this is. We received so much help and feedback on this from the members of the Anti-Eugenics Collective at Yale, and these are just some of the examples from across the gallery. There are also students creating content related to all of these themes for the museum app, and we definitely want there to be more related talks, tours, and events in the future. The Peabody is not just its artifacts and specimens, but also a living and changing and hopefully ever expanding community of people and of knowledge. Thank you so much for listening to this, and please do get in touch with feedback, suggestions, ideas for collaborations, or just ideas about how we can help support your own activities with our collection.
Okay, is this on? Thanks so much for having me. Thanks to the organizers of the conference. This feels unfortunately particularly urgent and necessary right now, as others have said over the past couple of days. And thank you to the other panelists for all of the work that you do. So when preparing for these 10 minutes, which I actually did write out because there's no way I can stick to 10 minutes otherwise, I found myself really struggling with how to narrow or focus this down, because all of my work essentially deals with histories of science, race, and colonialism in museums. As a historian of science and a writer, I use natural historical specimens gathered by and stolen from Black, enslaved, and indigenous communities around the world in gathering evidence for the extreme violence in 18th and 19th century colonial collecting practices. I rely, for instance, on herbarium specimens like this at institutions like the New York Botanical Garden that bear white colonizers' names, some of whom never actually left their homes in Britain or Europe, the Netherlands or the US, and are often simply attributed, if at all, to indige gesturing towards a person or a group of people who we'll never be able to fully biographize or restore credit to. I use bird skins to trace the history of how specimens were packed and shipped amidst the rise of global capitalism, knowing fully well that these birds were culled and stuffed with moss and other natural materials by, in this case, indigenous laborers, many of them children, whose expertise is now obscured in museums like the Natural History Museum's ornithological wing in Tring. Letters and archives like this one make glancing mention of men and women often referred to by their first names only, sometimes Christian names forced onto them, many of whom I can only trace if they found their own rare fleeting success in moving through colonial circles, as in the case of this Tamil man, Ananda Kumaraswamy. And these histories shape my teaching too, in classes like Unnatural History, Colonialism and Inequality in the Making of Nature. Thank you to many of my students for being here. In museums, Power and Politics, and in botanical bodies, Plants, Medicine, and Colonialism in the History of Science, my students visit sites like the Peabody to think through how exhibits continue to shape colonial narratives about the world, asking questions about, for example, whose work counts as art, and whose are displayed in natural history galleries as though they're frozen in time, even with the incredible input of people, including on this panel, who are working to shape these institutions into better, richer, more inclusive spaces. Watching students conduct their own research in these realms, ask probing questions about why institutions simply can't or won't do better, and go forth into their own careers and collections is hopeful, even as we acknowledge how slow institutional change really is. And as an activist, I fought for repatriation, especially of human remains, which I won't talk too much about today, consulting for university museums who are often under-resourced and sometimes genuinely really trying to return souls for rest, although not always. This has in many ways been the most frustrating part of the work that I do, acknowledging that most of the bodies held in collections around the US were in fact collected in the 20th century, despite institutions' repeated drive to blame collecting practices on racist 19th century colonizers. Reporting on the horrifying case of Penn anthropologist Janet Monge's display of child victims of the 1985 Philadelphia move bombing, Delicia and Katricia, Africa, in a Princeton Coursera tutorial that streamed to thousands of viewers, calling their bones, among other horrifying things, juicy and greasy, was in many ways a low point of my career, realizing exactly how far some people and universities will go to cover up their ongoing violences. Digging in their heels, Monge sued me and other writers for defamation in this sort of court case that will never end, apparently, while the Penn Museum refused to admit full wrongdoing, including their possession of both children's bones until late last year. Nor have they made meaningful change, simultaneously continuing to deny the extent of their holdings while skirting NAGPRA to quickly bury Black remains that may in fact have been covered under the law as Native American. This work is confusing and disheartening much of the time, and I'm really in awe of reporters like Nicole and folks at ProPublica who are sticking with these stories, really holding museums and universities accountable, making this visible far beyond just attention-grabbing headlines. Okay, so how do I bring this together in less than 10 minutes now? Sorry, collections around the world that simply wouldn't exist without specious race science, colonial violence, looting, grave robbing, environmental destruction in the global south, and more, lasting for centuries, again, well past the 19th century and into the present, as so many other presenters have been arguing during this conference. I don't think I can, but I'm going to give you just one example from my own work about how museums and other cultural institutions, and I'm considering the term museums kind of broadly and expansively here, many of them inextricably linked to universities and university research, have shaped grim views on race that we're poised to understand and unpack as historians. So my research for the past decade or so has mostly focused on plants, something that maybe seems a little more neutral than human remains and is less well-suited for repatriation, according to some, than indeed human remains. Even as plants were used to shape views on human bodies, from constructions of binary gender and sexuality to visions of racial hierarchies perpetuated by harmful ideas about what, for instance, the tropics as a singular zone looked like, which hardened in the late 18th and 19th centuries. Carl Linnaeus, working in the 18th century, famous for creating an artificial system of classification, still taught in Bio 101 classes as the father of modern biology, also categorized humans by complexion, as he referred to skin color, but also by cultural habits, customs, and most importantly, by geography. Central to the development of biogeography as a science, Linnaeus' ideas about the sexual system faded away over time, but some of his baseline categorizations prevailed, maybe unintentionally. This was evident at the New York Botanical Garden, again, a seemingly maybe neutral institution within the place of natural history museums. This is a place I do a lot of my research, and this is exhibited by their color-coded folder system. You can see here a map that was hung on the wall of the herbarium, so not open to the public, but open to researchers and collections managers, that indeed continued Linnaeus's color-coded geography of the world, coloring in, for instance, all of Asia as yellow, all of Africa as brown, all of the sort of Indian subcontinent as red, and America as white. Folders then in the herbarium corresponded to those color codes, right? So it's a bit hard to see because they're stacked vertically, but plants, herbarium specimens that were from the Americas were packed in white or manila folders, which were actually the cheapest, and they have the most of those. Money's always a concern. Specimens from Asia, for instance, were packed in yellow folders, and this became a really shorthand way of easily pulling out, let's say, all of the mosses from Asia. You can just grab the yellow folders. So in some ways, color coding works very well and very effectively. In other ways, this is replicating a Linnaean system of categorization by skin color based on geography. And in really practical terms, this also sets up the institution for a hostile workplace. So imagine that you are somebody who works in the herbarium and have to pull exclusively brown folders based on the fact that brown was the color coded for the African continent, right? Somebody took photos of these in the summer of 2020 and posted them on Instagram, and the New York Botanical Garden very quickly found funding to replace this color-coded system, right? Kind of unsurprising. And yet, I use this as a case study not because it's the most extreme example and not because it specifically deals with human remains, as much of my work does, but rather to say that really seemingly innocuous systems like color-coded folders, which really just becomes an issue of ease in collections management and money, quite frankly, at an institution that one might think does not hold racist practices, at least on the surface, really creates a hostile work environment for current employees and continues to perpetuate these really, really deeply held systems of violence. So I don't want to give the impression that this system is so profoundly broken and so hopeless that there's no path forward. Maybe, though. It's tempting to call on museums to simply empty out their storehouses, to close their doors, and to give the land back. Indeed, maybe we should. But there are ways forward, I think, and I am buoyed by people like Royce who are trying to do that work at the Peabody. We can, or at least I hope we can, demand accountability and better practices from these institutions at every level and at every level simultaneously. So collections managers, for example, like my friend Laura Briscoe at the New York Botanical Garden, have been thinking through how to handle racist and outdated language in the archives, not just by offering warnings. I think many of us are used to seeing content warnings now as we do our research to potential viewers, but handling metadata responsibly and ethically when encountering colonial place names, species names based on racial stereotypes, and harmful terminology for groups of people. And I would argue that this becomes particularly urgent as every institution rushes to digitize their material. Digitization is great in increasing accessibility, and it's very harmful when it simply replicates metadata, much of which was built in the mid-20th century, that was, at its very heart, deeply, deeply racist. Dr. Briscoe, among other people, conducted a survey about these collections, and the responses from other collections managers around the world were quite shocking. So just to quote some of the survey responses anonymously about whether these curators encountered offensive material in the archives. No, I curate invert collections. I've never run across problematic language on labels or associated data. Send your survey to Anthro Collections and managers. No, I'm surprised. Is this really a huge issue? Not saying it isn't, but some place names are what they are. You can read these, there are hundreds of them. Kind of the most astounding one is this one from Sweden, the birthplace of Carl Linnaeus, saying, "I'm totally confused about this non-existent problem." Scientists themselves have begun slowly to call for species name changes based on, for instance, slave owners and rapists, stopping cycles of offense while challenging the idea that names are permanent and immutable. Taxonomy, I'd argue, has always been shaped by humans. It's always been unstable, and it's always changed and continues to change in profound ways. We simply don't need to take for granted that names of birds or plants or minerals, or indeed the entire system itself, or species, which shift constantly, have to continue to be used for the sake of science. There are clear protocols for how names are changed, and we can force that change. We can more clearly communicate with researchers and visitors about what they're seeing, how it got there, and the institution's role in perpetuating violence, both in the past and the present. We can better investigate systems of credit in the archives, changing systems of authorship, because again, there is clear precedent for change here. This is far from impossible work. To make it explicit that the white man who ordered and named specimens from his home country in Sussex, for instance, isn't, in fact, the person who sought out, produced knowledge about that specimen, collected it, preserved it, shipped it, indeed performing the bulk of the labor and the knowledge production. Indeed, we can just tell better, richer stories more generally, relying on historians, among other people, to do this work, describing expeditionary science, which is where the bulk of collections come from at natural history museums, as something that demanded indigenous expertise and indigenous bodies, sometimes literally carrying colonizers on their backs up mountains and through forests, rather than celebrating the great men and women of science, stories that often make for neat 150-word wall labels. And above all else, we should take repatriation seriously, demanding it from every level. So I don't think we can rely on or trust universities or museums to seek this out or to take it on their own. I just don't really think that's practical. The cases where I have seen that happen are few and far between and are often based on getting ahead of potential backlash rather than genuinely believing in the mission. One might say that's better than nothing, but I think we can do better. Demanding repatriation as faculty, staff, and students, and I would argue especially students at institutions that are very scared of what their students have to say and have to post on social media, sends a very clear message to universities and university museums that we're noticing what's happening, that we have the direct training and expertise to make that visible, and that we simply expect better of the institutions that we work at. Museums are central to our work, from research and writing to teaching and learning from collections, and they should not only be held to the high standards that we are, quite frankly, in pursuing tenure or promotion, that we're held to as educators and scholars and historians, but that we have a responsibility, especially at this university, which many other universities take precedent from, to set that precedent for other museums and institutions to shape their collections management policies, their practices of display, and their outreach with better futures in mind. Okay, I have a lot to say about this, but I'm going to wrap it up neatly here, and hopefully we can have a good discussion. Yeah. Thanks.
Sorry. So we definitely have time for some questions. I'd actually like to open it up to the audience first, and I can see we already have somebody ready.
Sure. Thank you all for those presentations. My question will start with you, Royce, but it's actually for the whole panel. And it's about whether or not you started off saying that museums are by nature colonial spaces. And so the question is are they colonial in organization and presentation or also in conceptualization, right? And if they're colonial in conceptualization, can they really be decolonialized, right? It's like asking, can you decolonize a slave ship? Make it nicer, put a bathroom in, right? And anthropology had to deal with this in its early conception, that in realizing the moment you set yourself up to study and examine the other, that's when you've gone wrong, right? And if that's still the job of particularly museums dealing with any kind of human or cultural exhibit, is it still, is still essentially the mission, right? And is that still colonial?
Yeah, the operation of a museum that was created by a colonial institution will always be a colonial institution in every single facet. We work together, I think, in different ways to try and see what is the capacity for change, more so than not just a one-off, news piece or social media post now, or one person's short position who then are either pushed out or students graduate, they move on. What is the sustainability of those decolonizing actions? Many of the movements to create practices that begin to not just chip away, but they just burn them. They burn those practices, we're starting over. TK labels, traditional knowledge labels, care labels, all of those are actually made for indigenous institutions. Institutions that are building from the ground up. Institutions which foster a wellness, or at least a goal of wellness and relationality amongst their staff members who don't just come to work. I think a colonial institution, you can identify that immediately if really it's been decolonized by the staff members who come to work but don't really leave their work there. The burden on many indigenous people or people who are married in or adopted and actually truly value and have kinship with indigenous people is that we don't just leave. I think I'm one of the few on my staff and here on campus that works with the collections that I know every single way that the efforts and actions and impacts of everyone else's work on the relationships that I can build, on the environment that I can foster and tend to and to steward for these works, all of their actions impact the type of community I go home to. So it's not simply that I work here, it's that I'm invested in seeing what I can do because my own ancestors are here at this university. My family's medicine bundles are kept here at the university. And I feel that fear every single day that if I speak too much, if I push too fast, but then I don't quite understand what's happening, if I ruffle too many feathers, will I become one of the many who are isolated from even getting a phone call back, an email back, when we are offering to repatriate items, when we're offering to steward items? That's very real. So a Western institution that happens at every single level. It's not like, can we decolonize this exhibition space? Can we actually foster growth and healing and understanding at every single part of exhibition development, collection care and management, and then PR and promotion and outreach? What is the wellness of the community that this museum fosters? Where are the stakeholders from the local tribal nations, the regional groups? Where's the stakeholders with the students, faculty? Are there any indigenous faculty on the museum board, the curatorial board, on the gallery board? To my knowledge, no, not yet. So, I hope to be someone who can assist in that, but I certainly know I'm a guest here. So I'm a guest in these homelands. I'm also on borrowed time. My own community and my own family. I could do a lot of work back home in many communities, but I choose to be here so that I can steward the ancestors that weren't returned. So I can steward those materials in a way that someone who is brought up in these ways just approaches it differently. And that's hard to teach. Yeah. So I'll go ahead and pass it.
That was very well said. I almost feel foolish trying to even answer, but I will also say, as evidenced here, I think there has been a sea change in some of the institutions in terms of repatriation and who's in charge of it. That's not to say it's a very easy situation, but there are different places where you now see people being hired into repatriation offices who studied that all their career, their entire career, want to do that. Whereas when we looked into the Smithsonian itself and who was hired within those collections, it was such a new idea that there was so much pushback from the physical anthropology department. There were people who were saying, can you convince these tribal nations to let us keep them? And we actually had one of these original repatriation office employees reach out to us after we published and gave us a trove of documents, actually, because she was just so upset with the fact that so many of these remains were still at the Smithsonian. And so there are people who are trying to do it correctly in the way that they really believe. Obviously, there are some forces. It's a different time. But as you can see with Royce and other people throughout the industry, there are people who are trying to do this in the right way and trying to do it really authentically.
Okay, we have a question here.
Yes, I want to commend you all as well. I think it's very important work you're engaged in on very different levels. I am really struck by several things, though. First of all, someone make reference to the sea change that the universities are experiencing at this point, and I think that's true. And it is important, Royce, to recognize that. But I understand the personal challenges that you speak of too, in terms of how you will devote your life and your skills. It's important, though, to recognize the how difficult this process is. David, I hope you won't mind me calling you out, but I was a student here in the 1960s. I wasn't here yet. Okay, I'll accept that. But the Yale and Slavery Project that David has so masterfully overseen. When I was here as a student, we were unable to get the university to make any acknowledgement of its role in slavery. It would not admit that its original inaugural trustees were slaveholders or benefited economically from the slave trade. It would not admit even that there was slave labor used to build many of the campuses, at least one of the buildings here on campus. It took 60 years for the country to move from this protest that we black students held on campus here, trying to get the university to acknowledge its role, and before it would actually do so for the record in the project that David led. And I do want to personally thank you, David. I don't think I've had the opportunity to do that before publicly, but I do recognize the importance of the work that you did. But then go back again to the work that you young ladies are doing, and the great risks that you're putting your careers and your lives to, particularly in the environment we're dealing with now. I worry that there are not enough people, Royce, who understand the challenges that you speak of, and just what it will take to make meaningful change and see changes that don't take 60 years.
I want to thank the panelists. I have a question that I think is more geared towards Nicole, but I think all can feel free to answer. It's more generally about, well, I'm sorry, it's a little bit cynical, but it has to do with public-facing messaging, and particularly because, Nicole, you are a journalist. So I really appreciated the piece on alles Hiraacá. A lot of my colleagues, we work on this, and we know it. But I guess the question is, in your view, or from your perspective, what are the ways in which this kind of history, this kind of knowledge, can be normalized within public discourse at a national level? We're in a room with people who are like-minded, and given the current state of the country, it is very clear that there are far more rooms with people who are not like-minded. So it's great that we can do this here. But for people who have the ability to speak more broadly in more public-facing fora, how do we then tell these kinds of stories, right, in bite-sized, Instagrammable, small media nuggets, such that everyday people who do not go to Yale, who actually dislike universities and think they're suspicious, how do they get to know this particular information? I think of, like, when you mentioned alles Hiraacá, I couldn't help thinking about P.T. Barnum and the Aztec children and the people he put on display and the fact that we decided that we needed to have a musical about him. Like, that to me, in this day and age, I was sort of like, who did that? And then to the same point is naming and renaming. I know that the people in this room understand why things are renamed, but you would be not shocked if you are to go and talk to people who have a different opinion, who would suggest, well, if we can rename everything, if we have to rename statues, if we have to rename birds, who cares if it's the Gulf of America? Do I think that this is the same and like parallel logical reasoning? No. But as I said, I'm talking about beyond this room. How do we figure out how to do this effectively such that we have an ability to have these future discussions given where the country is right now?
I actually don't find that cynical. I think that's just a reality-based question. So no worries. And also, thank you so much for your comment. When I said sea change, I'm not trying to say everything is great. It really depends on the leadership of different places. Just to kind of go back to our project, the person at the top of the Smithsonian right now is Lonnie Bunch III, who created the African American History Museum. Other Smithsonian secretaries were not as open to repatriation, but in our and I will give credit during our conversation. I was asking some questions of the secretary, like, well, some people say alles Hiraacá isn't necessarily as racist because of XYZ, and he kind of shut the question down and was like, I don't care. That's untrue. Like, we know what this man stands for. So it really does. It does rely on a lot of leadership, but then there are also tons of outside forces. I think these questions are related. At the same time, the Smithsonian has also, shut its DEI offices because of an executive order. So there are all sorts of different contexts that we're working with now. I think for public-facing people, I'm proud that I can't. I mean, I take that as a direct challenge myself. To be able to tell these stories in such a way that are very engaging to get people to read about them. That's partly why we started. We're thinking about different ways of how to tell these stories. That's why there was an illustrated, basically comic book, in a way that's going to grab people, in a way that I love a 5,000-word story, don't get me wrong, but I know that a lot of people might not get all the way through. I know that a 12-year-old isn't like, wow, great time to sit down with the Washington Post. But I am heartened that when we do things like this comic book, there are people who said, my 12-year-old was reading that. They were reading we actually put out a printed version with the Sunday paper, if anyone gets those anymore. But you can get the comic book anyway on our site. And they read the whole thing through. And so we're thinking of ways to actually keep people engaged because these subjects are very interesting. I mean, we got a ton. I'm not someone who only cares about metrics, but like the engagement shows, like this kind of deep reporting shows, this kind of deep work shows that people do want to know about that. That's why we're trying to, when we roll out a big project like this, I'm really lucky that we have people who are working on our social media team to like create those slideshows that you share on that I share on Instagram, those Instagram reels that people are looking through, so that these stories do get to people who may not subscribe to the Washington Post or who may not subscribe to the New York Times. Like, some of these stories break through, and like one part of my job is finding the stories that break through and presenting them contextually so that people really know the history of this country and what is really behind so much of the institutions that people think they know about.
So we're at time, just to keep things up. And I apologize. I think the pressure is toward Dan. I'm looking at you. Okay. So you're welcome. We're happy to answer questions individually, but I'd like to turn this over to Dan. And please join me in thanking our presenters.
Well, first, thank you. What an amazing panel, and how all your presentations fit together. So before, we want to just give you a little bit direction for those going to the Peabody, and maybe just show of hands who will be joining us here. Okay. And where are my colleagues from the Peabody? Okay. So we're going to meet. Do you want to come? Yeah. I'm just going to invite our colleagues from the Peabody come. They're going to tell us just about how we're going to get there and a little bit about what we're going to see, and then we'll have a little time to use the restroom and head out. And then for everyone else, a reminder: we're starting tomorrow morning at 8:30 for coffee, 9 to start. Three more amazing panels: scientific racism in the mid-20th century, a panel on community-based medicine and anti-racist clinical practice, and then an afternoon concluding roundtable. Okay, do you want to come here quickly? Okay, and Caitlin, go ahead.
All right. Hi, everybody. I'm Caitlin Rogers. I head up the exhibitions department at the Peabody. And we don't have Alexi here today, but Dan has kindly offered to explain a little bit more about the components of that gallery that relate to the talks that we've heard today. And we also have some of our other colleagues here. So Susan Butts is our head of collections and research, and Charlie Kataklis is our interpretation manager. So we'll also have an opportunity over there to learn a little bit more about our interpretive strategy and what we've been doing at the Peabody since we reopened a year ago.
So we're going to meet in the front.
Here? Do you want to meet outside here?
What's that? Yeah.
Just to mention that we would introduce the sage.
Yes, right. Okay, so I'll go over together. So we can meet outside here in maybe about 5 or 10 minutes, and then we'll walk up to the Peabody together. All right, thank you.